Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm back with a now regular guest, Tom van der Lubbe. He's the lead link of Visie, a mortgage advisory company in the Netherlands, who have some very interesting work practices. They use holacracy, and for those familiar with that, it's a business operating system for empowering staff to a degree that is not usual in our businesses today. And today we're not going to talk about Visie. We're going to make an experiment. We're going to do together a book review. And this was Tom's idea. Kudos to Tom. Tom chose the book, and it is Small is Beautiful. That's whiting out a little bit on the screen there. Small is Beautiful by E F Schumacher. He's German-born, but spent a lot of his time in Britain. And I thought we'd start, I suppose, Tom, why pick this book to be the subject of our first experiment?
Yeah, there are more reasons. One general reason is I think we should read more books, and especially also classical stuff. Because then we see, and that's the second point, we see that a lot of topics are much older than we think they are, and we will find a lot of examples in this book. And this book is from the beginning of the 70s, and what I find striking is that in the whole COVID period, where there's a lot of discussion going on about shall we continue the way we work now, that if you read a book which is nearly 50 years old, that you find out that the topics are not so new we're discussing now. So that are the two reasons. But I also think we should read much more philosophy instead of management books. So I think this book has two aspects. It has a lot of topics about economy, but there's also a lot about ethics and philosophy, etc., in it.
Right. Yes. And in a sense, you could. I mean, that's the central theme, isn't it? Really, that this idea that business has improved our living standards, enterprise and industrialization, I suppose, in general, has improved our living standards, but to the detriment of our culture. And of course, when we think about culture, we're talking about philosophy, ethics as being the underpinnings for whatever culture we create. And so I think there's some interesting questions here and he talks about it in terms of education, and he talks about it generally in terms of business philosophy. But are we losing our connection to culture, losing our connection to philosophy, losing our connection to ethics as we go about building our businesses?
Yeah, and I think the first part of the book has 4 parts, and I think the first part, which you also find as a topic again now, is that should economy be a kind of neutral, abstract science, or is it about values? And you can still see in the English language where you talk, and a certain university, it's still called political economy. That economy, let's say from its history, always had values embedded in it as a science. So it's not an abstract kind of physics. No, it's about what's right and wrong, and perhaps that should be the starting point, because he discusses values and also shows that perhaps the interesting thing is, and that's what I find one of the most interesting parts of the book, that he says we are ended up in a very strange situation, that economy is let's say thriving to things which are, let's say, contrary to the values we have. So for instance, profit maximization, and then he takes the Buddhist economy as an example, and perhaps we could dive into that just to show that on the one hand, and that's a discussion which is also actually going on, what is important for a society and what is not important for a society, and how do we value this in a society.
Yes, And then he dives specifically into this moral assertion about the function of work. But I wonder actually then, before we dive into that specifics on the ethics of work, does he say something more broadly about society that we want to talk about?
Yes, I think that in the first part, he, for instance, which I find very interesting, for instance, he's quoting Gandhi, and he says, okay, the world is big enough to care for all the needs we have, but the world is not big enough to care for our, how do you call this? Greed. That's the word he uses. And I mean, that's a very philosophical, ethical starting point. And the context of the 70s, the book was written in 73, was this Club of Rome report. So you also have this whole idea of are we responsible? Are we acting in a responsible way towards our world, our globe, or our natural resources? And that's the starting point of the book, which the answer, it's a very rhetorical question. The answer is no. We are behaving in a very egoistic, short-term oriented way, and we should care about the generations after us.
Yeah. And that links well then to his the statement that he includes. I'm not now sure. Yes, this is from him here. I'll just read the section here. The Buddhist point of view takes the function of work to be at least threefold: to give a man a chance to utilize and develop his faculties, to enable him to overcome his ego-centeredness by joining with other people in a common task, and to bring forth the goods and service needed for a becoming existence. And that really struck me. And for many of us, I think we do enjoy work and an occupation that allows us, or at least allows those three things to be true for us. But for many, that is not the case, is it? And he goes on to organize work in such a manner that it becomes meaningless, boring, stultifying, or nerve-wracking for the worker would be little short of criminal.
Yeah, and that's a very ethical point of view, but it's also, if you just go back to the roots of economy, it always has been about values. And the point he also explains, and I don't know if the quote is from Oscar Wilde, but you have this quote: "We know the price of everything, but we don't know the value of anything." So, and the interesting thing is, which he has studied economics, and he says the absurd thing is that the things we value most don't have a price, or are not counted in our discipline of economy. So if people care for children or care for each other, etc., and there's no price tag on it, it's not counted. So it's not economic growth. And let's say pollution is there's value, or even we create a lot of plastics, etc. And there you have exactly the other way around. So, and then he even asked the question if this way of let's say behaving, or let's say the way we act in this economic discipline, is this even counterproductive in becoming a better world? So that this discipline, which from a starting point had a value starting point, has been transformed into the opposite, because let's say there's a price tag on growth, but it can be very destructive. And on the other hand, if there's no price tag on it, it can be, let's say, from a value point of view, very important for society.
Right. Yeah.
No, and then he ends up saying, just see Buddhist economy, but you also could say, if you take the Greek way of seeing or demos, etc., then it's also about value. Or if you take, let's say, the Christianity, it's also about values. And you also see that, for instance, we think that there's a kind of right of having a job. And then in the Buddhist economy, as the quote you just mentioned, I think it's expressed in a very beautiful way that we should reflect on that, that there's a kind of right, also from a humanistic point of view, that everybody should have a job.
Yeah. Yeah. And let me just pause. I'm just going to plug my laptop in properly. Yes, that's right. And this links to another, well, I suppose another way of framing this idea that one of the things that we tend to do or can do in, I suppose, modern industrial society is to put the human in service of the machine. And we might think that that's a sort of an industrial idea, that when we were serving these great machines in heavy industry, but to some extent we're still doing that, right? But the machines are different, they're informational machines. And I think he's making this point here is that these tools, this technology should be in service of us, in service of us as a human being, developing our faculties, overcoming egocentrism, merging with others to build something greater than ourselves. And this idea of a becoming existence, so a purposeful life, like such important ideas that, you know, are just not considered in most, certainly in large corporations, not considered seriously. And I guess that takes us back to the small is beautiful idea, perhaps much harder to do as organizations become larger.
But it's also a discussion which is going on in society at the moment. So if you take, for instance, discussion about well-being, then let's say the starting point would be just forget about anything we have and what would be the desirable outcomes. And then, for instance, in this COVID crisis, you see that things which are very important for society, nurses, etc., people working in hospitals, teachers, in this whole, let's say, classical discussion we have the absurd situation that things which we value most or we should value most don't have a price tag or a very low price tag, and the stuff which we don't value a lot or are not very important for our well-being. I would say, take an example, financial industry, day trading, or a lot of transactions going on without any positive outcome for society, creates an enormous amount of wealth. And that's something which he describes, to my point of view, in a very good way. But this discussion is as old as history. So you can take Buddha, you can take the Greeks, etc. But at the moment you have also on the macroeconomic level in New Zealand, the situation that I just forgot her name. She says, okay, now the starting point should be well-being, and from that point we should start to discuss about our budgets. So, and then she says, okay, we want to, let's say, increase life expectancy, or we want to reduce addiction, etc. So you start from a value-oriented starting point. And the point he makes is, he says, we have a very quantitative approach, another way. This approach should much more focused on qualitative outcomes.
Right. Yes. Yes, absolutely we do, don't we? We run our economies to a very large extent at the macro level on quantitative basis. You know, we talk about GDP numbers. We talk about, well, even, you know, we will talk about employment figures. We'll everything, or the conversation is dominated by numbers. I mean, even in the COVID crisis, right? It's all numbers. It's all. It's not. It's much less about what do we need to value in our lives in order to be as healthy as we can be, to fight this disease. It's everything is reduced. The conversation is so frequently reduced to numbers.
But what I find even more interesting, which is a more, let's say, he's very strong also from a theoretical point of view. So there's a point in the book, in the second part, active side of the balance sheet, so to say, and then he says, in the end, we have turned it around. So the bad has become the goal. For instance, greed. So profit maximization, is in the end greed, and it doesn't matter the whole discussion about multi-stakeholder. And then in the multi-stakeholder debate, it shouldn't be all about maximizing profits, but in our way of economic thinking at the moment, it's about maximizing profits. And if you then go back to philosophy, etc., or religion, then profit maximization and harming others is seen as something very negative. So, and then you have the whole discussion about egoism versus altruism. And he says the positive thing is in our economic model is bad. So our old virtues and love and caring for each other and giving away stuff away and treating your clients and suppliers much better and giving them enough space. This is from our economic way of thinking at the moment. It's a bad thing to do. And he says it's a systemic or a systematic problem embedded in this science of economics. And that's what I find from an international point of view very interesting. So he says this whole discipline of economics is even a barrier to solving our problems.
Yeah.
And is somebody who has studied economics and has been a professor for economics and has written stuff for Keynes, etc. So that's what I find very interesting.
Yeah. He's, yeah, in a sense, he's rejecting the entire basis on which we think about economies. Yeah.
And it's the same what you see in the whole debate or circular economy. That what I find from an intellectual point of view very interesting, if you have to keep it in the ground movement, that they just counted all the reserves of all the oil companies and said you're not able to burn all this oil because then the rising climate temperature would be so high that we have destroyed ourselves, and that's why you have to write down those reserves of which are on your balance sheets, which is taking place at the moment. So it's a very abstract intellectual way of thinking, where somebody shows that the mental box in which we are is the wrong mental box. So if you are in a growth mental box, you don't understand circular.
Right.
And he does exactly the same with the economic discipline. And you see this in a more, let's say, soft way if you take Matsukato and all those people who are writing those books or these books in this current time. But I think he is, from an intellectual point of view, much more strict and shows the contradictions in the way of scientific thinking in the discipline of economics itself.
Right. But isn't the example you've just given of the oil companies needing to run down the assets, I suppose the reserves on their balance sheets, or the way that that's valued on their balance sheets, run them down and not add to them? But even again, isn't that looking at it in a numerical frame?
Sure, but
right?
that's
As opposed to coming back to, what do we need to value? What do we need to value in this world? Like what's our orientation to this world? Where do we want to direct our action according to an ethical framework? Like that seems to me the starting point, not like what your reserves are and how does that look on your balance sheet.
But that's right. But if you want to, let's say, dive into somebody else's minds, and you have to deal with people who are only thinking in Excel sheets, then I think it's an intelligent move to just count all these reserves together, and then take this mathematical framework and just then explaining that for every tons of oil reserve, you have an addition on your temperature of X, and then just showing in their own mental framework that also in their mental framework it's not going to take place, because the temperature will rise on a level which are not able to survive. Although the starting point should be, from an ethical point of view, we should be against pollution, or we should be against taking all the stuff out of natural resources for our generation and not leaving something for the rest, which he also does in the book, because and it's exactly the same discussion we have at the moment. There is an Excel sheet in the book about the percentage of resources, of natural resources, of certain metals, and that's also stuff you also see in the books at the moment, but just with different numbers, because this Excel sheet in the book of Schumacher is 50 years ago.
Yes, but I suppose I do differ there, because I think there's a problem if you get into these calculations, is that you're feeding the beast. You're feeding that intellectual beast that wants to reduce the world to numbers. And I think there's something to be said for stepping away from that. As much as people feel that they want to see the world in that way.
Yeah, but just take an example. If you would, let's say, if you have a heating topic, so otherwise we starve to death, then and you have oil and gas, etc., and you just know that we're nearly to the end, as an example, and then you say, okay, then we have used all the stuff, what we're going to do next, and then you can say, okay, let's invent nuclear energy, or nuclear energy will be back on the agenda, and this kind of stuff. So I totally agree with you that it makes much more sense to start with a humanistic approach. But it's exactly the same topic, and that's mainly your topic about being human, that I always say, if you are shareholder value driven and you don't care about your people, you still should, let's say, read this stuff, because also in your framing of shareholder value maximization, it makes sense to be human.
Yes.
That's and my starting point is not, I mean, I would prefer people to have all as a starting point that we should care for others and being human. But if you don't like other people and you just want to squeeze them as much as possible, then I try to show them that if they want to maximize their profits, it makes sense from their rational point of view to be more human.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Sort of meet them at their level, and persuade them in terms that they're already familiar with. Although I think the danger with it is if you end up perpetuating an intellectual game, a rational game, if you like. And I think in the long run, perhaps it's better to work to connect people more to their heart, to connect people more to myths and stories, even that bring the conversation into the realm of ethics and philosophy, that gives us a chance to. I think that's the real opportunity for the reset.
Okay, but that's where we differ. So for instance, if it's about layoffs, I don't want to explain a CFO that from a human point of view he shouldn't lay off people. No, then I prefer to dive into his mental box, or mainly these are men, and not trying to say, okay, when you were the one who was laid off, what would you feel? No, then I would say, okay, if you want to maximize or stabilize your company and then see this research, companies who try to avoid layoffs as long as possible were more successful than companies who laid off their people. And then I know I think I have a higher chance of reaching this person, because otherwise he just said he doesn't understand. I'm the CFO, and the faster I lay off my people, the higher my chances of surviving or doing better than my competitors. And then we say, no, have a look at the research. It's exactly the opposite, but it's perhaps counterintuitive.
Right.
And that's the mental game I like, which Schumacher plays in an excellent way, and plays, to my point of view, much more intelligent than a lot of books which are written at this current moment.
Right. And tactically, you might be right, especially if you're dealing with a sociopath. Then there's some who are overrepresented amongst executives. in which case the empathic route is going to have no chance. Yes. The other thing I thought we'd talk about, and I suppose this does talk to my perspective here in the longer run of operating from a different intellectual framework, and that's one based in ethics and philosophy. And he talks in chapter 6 about the greatest resource being education, and him lamenting the death of metaphysics as he describes it in our education. And it really had me reflecting on my own education, firstly in school and then as an engineer and so on. And I just recall just how little, just how scant was regard for for two things really. One was for sort of ethics and philosophy in and of itself as a topic to explore, as a topic to be instructed in. And then secondly, to be able to link that across the disciplines. So what does it mean to be, let's say, an ethical engineer? Or what does it mean to be an ethical actor or dancer or mathematician? Like joining the dots in a philosophical framework just was not part at all of my education. And I think he makes a very powerful point in chapter 6 around that.
And he also, but there again, he shows that, for instance, I mean, I wrote an article, less is more, but also, let's say from, I mean, there's a lot of research is done that more, for instance, wealth doesn't make you happier. So and then you even can go further that it's counterproductive. And let's say you also know from families, I mean, that's what we call they are spoiled. So we still have in our language, in our way of behaving. And if you talk about children, it should be a balance. If we spoil them, they will be unhappy. But then on a systematic level in society, we're doing all the time. We're doing this. So the main thing is that we have too much of everything. So all the mental issues, addiction, it's not that we're starving to death. No, we have too much sugar, we have too much, etc., etc. So, and that's also something he shows. But there's a lot of research done. So people who have won the lottery, they're not happier afterwards. But we think that if we win the lottery, we will be happier. And then I will say, look at the research. Again, on the research, it's even the opposite. So it's better not to win the lottery.
Right. Yes.
But that's the intellectual scientific game I like a lot. But also, for instance, a paradox of choice. So the more choices you have, the more you're not sure what shall I take, and it causes a lot of stress.
Yeah. The great example of that is supermarket shopping. So we've got these German discount supermarkets, and occasionally I'll go to the one in our local town. You're in and out in like 10 minutes, no stress. There's only two types of cheese to drink, 2 types of coffee, like, and of course the paradox there is that often they're very good quality, because if you're only picking one type of brie, let's say, you're going to make sure it's a good one.
Yeah, that's what he, for instance, describes, and he says, okay, this whole mass production, it's dehumanizing. But it's on a lot of levels. It's on the one hand, for instance, those people who have read Harari. When I read this book, I thought, okay, Harari has also read Schumacher, because the whole topic of how do we treat animals, and then he also takes Buddhism again. It's exactly the discussion we have at the moment.
You're referring to Harari, Homo sapiens, right?
Yeah.
And so for those who haven't read that book, because I haven't read that book, tell us the linkage there. Because
no, he says, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, there's also nothing new, but a lot of people say, okay, the way you treat animals says also something about our own mental situation we're in. And I mean, the Buddhists have the most extreme way. And it's these monks, they are waving the flies away because they are not allowed to step on them. And Harari has also put it in a more modern context, but he also says, okay, what gives us the right to treat our animals like this? And does it say something about the way we behave as human beings also in our connection to each other?
Right.
It's in German you would say Verdinglichung. You make everything is an object. So an animal is an object, but also human resources is also treating people as objects. You're not treating them as human beings. That's why I dislike the word HR, because a resource is taking the humanity out of the word, so to say. And that's something he also describes, and says that in the way we are harming ourselves by, and then also let's say science plays a role or machines plays a role, but it should be a much more fundamental discussion about language. He talks a lot about language as well.
Yeah.
And Harari is I mean, probably somebody a lot of people read at the moment, but he does exactly the same.
Yeah, and that's so true. We had a guest on the show, Jamie Cato, who was got quite aggressive with me in the podcast, asking me if I still went to supermarkets because supermarkets are complicit in the mass genocide of certain species, right? And if you look at it, if you look at industrial farming, in a sense, that's exactly what it is. And we don't kill our, well, we don't intentionally kill our employees. So of course, we do know that one of the biggest causes of death for human beings is workplace stress. So in a sense, our industrial culture is killing human beings. And it's certainly having this effect, as you say, of robbing society to some degree of its culture and us as individuals of our humanity. I think that's absolutely right, and we can look to the way we treat animals as for an indicator of who we are.
And another good example, where you can also see that from an individualistic point of view, it may seem that you can optimize your own individual situation, but in the end, it's also counterproductive for your own individual situation. And he takes as an example, for instance, security. And at the moment, with Trump and the US, is a very good example. And you have those movies of people who are not closing the door more. Or also life expectancy. Life expectancy is going down in the US. So, or if the chance of being killed or robbed, which harms your mental status, then we should reflect on that and say, okay, a more equal way of wealth distribution will also be better for myself, although I'm rich.
Right.
And that's something. So if, let's say, if people are enormously rich, but they have to put a fence around their houses, and the chance that their children are kidnapped, or there are a lot of, let's say, people behind bars, or there are a lot of people driving with alcohol because of misery, etc., then the chance is much higher that your life expectancy goes down, and that's exactly what's happening. So also for your own individual situation, it makes sense to let's say more focused on a general let's say well-being of other people. And then I'm not talking about that, for instance, giving away gives you as a person a very positive feedback. No, I'm just also taking it very abstract, that at a certain point it makes sense to think in a more collective way, because it will be positive for your own individual goals.
Right. Yes, and in the book he gives the example of the Scott Barber company who builds up a company in the UK, and then
Yeah.
he hands it over to the company in terms of its ownership, but also has this constitution, and as part of the constitution, it says it's the ratio 6-1, right? No individual employee can earn more than 6 times that of anybody else, as a means of ensuring that. But I also think there's the broader context again, and it comes back to his phrase as death of metaphysics, is what you're describing there is a kind of a long run wise view of what happens if we allow inequality to rise too steeply or to get to an extent too greater a degree, that can kind of guide us in our moral choices, and it doesn't exist in our early training, right? The sort of the that wisdom isn't passed on. We're not encouraged to ask ourselves those questions, to think in those times, in those terms, should I say. I think that's I suppose why he gives it such prominence is this greatest resource, education. I keep coming back to that, like, and I just look at my own moral training or lack of it. I can't remember ever having conversations of that nature growing up.
But it's the old education. Huh? It's the old education of philosophy and humanities, which, let's say, if you have a strong educational background on that, and you would become, let's say, a billionaire yourself, you know from a scientific point of view that you should be very careful not spoiling your children, because they will end unhappy. So if you know from a scientific point of view that happiness has a or fulfillment is the better word than happiness, but if that people should have the opportunity to find fulfillment by doing things on their own, then the old idea is that you should invest in education. That's why education is so prominent also in this book. And then people have a kind of, let's say, starting point. They have an intellectual starting point. They have a kind of toolkit, and then they should do it themselves. That's the highest recipe for, let's say, fulfillment. But that's philosophy. So Aristotle would say live a moderate life. Aristotle wouldn't say become as rich as possible and party all night. No, it's about moderation all the time. And we don't live in a time where, let's say, or Aristotle is dominant and we tell each other live a moderate life. No, it's about who has the biggest house and how many square meters Jeff Bezos just bought, and how big is your ship, and what's your private jet, etc. From a philosophical point of view, it's the best recipe for ending unhappy.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah, and look at it in culture right now. I mean, the unhappiness rates are increasing. You've only got to turn on the news to see how culture is degraded in recent times. And also, as I think about this, we think of education, or certainly I think of it as schooling. But also, again, because of the way as societies we've become much more mobile, we've tended to concentrate capital into cities and opportunity into cities. People move around a lot more. I was barely exposed to my grandparents growing up. And it may be grandparents who would have had that slightly longer term view, who had accumulated more wisdom, might have been more interested in having more philosophical conversations with me, let's say. I had almost no contact with them. So I think there are many facets to our current culture that mitigate against having this kind of training in youth.
That's why I always like to talk to people who don't have agenda anymore. So your own parents have agenda. They want you to be successful, between brackets. And let's say the older generation wouldn't be much more, let's say, has more reflection. And I would say now it's about being happy or in balance, etc. Perhaps it's changing a little bit because people are much older nowadays when they get children. So I mean, I'm 52 and I have 2 small children, and I think I'm more relaxed on this topic than if I would have been a father let's say 20 years earlier, and then perhaps this whole idea of succeeding in society and having great notes in school would be perhaps more prominent, because I have a little bit more life experience, and I see that, let's say, becoming a CEO of a stock listed company is not something which will make you happy, because I know too many who reached that point and they ended being unhappy and telling other people, let's say, in a very safe environment, I wouldn't choose the same route again, but I can't tell openly. And these are the topics you cover in your podcast a lot.
Yes, well, yes, indeed. I thought the other thing I'd touch on here, which brings it back to work and practicalities a bit in the book, and this is within the economics, Buddhist economics chapter 4, page 40, and he's talking about the loom, right? The carpet loom in particular. The power loom is a machine, and its significance as a destroyer of culture lies in the fact that it does the essentially human part of the work. So again, the power loom is a machine, and its significance as a destroyer of culture lies in the fact that it does the essentially human part of the work. And so he's linking this machine right the way out to destroying culture, because the machine does the human part of the work. And I keep coming back to that idea in the book that we have to put our machines at the service of us. We have to have within our work the ability to express our human qualities with the machines at our service. And so many of our environments don't allow us to do that. And thinking back to animals, it's just the same way we treat animals. A big part of the animal welfare movement is about allowing, let's say, a chicken to express its chickenness, right? To scratch and peck and make friends and climb and fly around, right? So many of our business cultures don't allow us to express our humanness and apply that human touch to whatever it is we're working on.
What I find interesting, because we also talked about in the past, and that was the last part of the book, is this whole idea of, also the title, Small is Beautiful. But for instance, that's something which we, with the whole agile movement and all those IT companies, are much more familiar with. Is that small is beautiful, small teams, agility, and then suddenly we realize, okay, small is beautiful. And then if it's more about values, we're not nearly there, so to say. And in the last part of the book, he talks about self-organization, subsidiarity, about too many rules, and also their values, because values are very efficient. So if you don't have a lot of values, or if you're not very value oriented, you have this whole compliance a culture dominated by lawyers who earn a lot and don't contribute anything to society, so to say. So there, in this whole organizational stuff or topic, there we are because of the whole agility movement, are much closer to his ideas, I guess, than on the let's say in the other chapters of the book.
Yeah, and I think another thread in the agility movement is craftsmanship, which again is about me putting my human touch on whatever the artifact is, be it software or anything else, and working in a small teams where I can be recognized as an individual. I can build relationships, I can express my humanity, I can have sort of natural experiences at work. This is so so important as an idea. And the small is beautiful, small as a team, but also small in a sense of the work. It's like I'm not like a small part of like big work. I've got some autonomy and some ownership of a small chunk of that work that I can call my own, that I can apply my touch to. And I think we also see it in Etsy, let's say. So I'm trying to wean myself off Amazon, and one of the places I go to is Etsy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a sort of successful community of people in small batch productions, hand finished products.
Yeah, that's a very good example.
Yeah, this is almost the counter movement. I think this is more Schumacherian, let's say, in its ethos. And I hear that more and more, like people coming to this realization that cheap isn't good. Cheap isn't, or at least isn't necessary.
Yeah, and also that is on the one hand you have globalization, and other people are rediscovering their neighborhoods. So it's also about localizing, which also in the COVID crisis, because people couldn't travel, I just say, okay, oh, I didn't know that the city I live in, or the province, or the country I live in is as interesting as taking a plane to another destination. And I'm not talking about, let's say, always about about climate, etc. But that's also something that there's kind of correction, I think, more or less going on. That traveling a lot has sometimes positive sides, but also a lot of negative sides on your family life, etc. So I'm very curious, when the crisis is over, what will stay, and where will we go back to the old normal, or are we able to invent a kind of new normal? And I think that a lot of people who had to commute long distances are really questioning if they want to do this in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really hopeful, and of course, there are indicators in both directions, because a lot of the big firms have got a lot bigger. We've lost a huge number of small businesses. So in some ways, this governments have got a lot bigger, right? they've built up much bigger, debt piles as a result of this, which they're going to need to pay off somehow, right? Which probably means bringing more people at higher levels into the sort of tax catchment. So on the one hand, all of those big entities have got smaller, and a lot of the smaller entities have been killed off. And as you say, there perhaps is, looking from a hopeful perspective, an opportunity to grow back smaller, not build back better, grow back smaller, grow back more locally.
Yeah, and to put some discussion into it, it also is interesting to see what will happen about this whole role of the state, because in the past we said everything should be private and we don't need the state, because just leave us alone. We, as a business community, we don't need them. Now the state is very dominant, because let's say, because we're in trouble now, we say we need the state, otherwise we go bankrupt, so please subsidize us. But on the other hand, you also see a lot of discussion going on about new forms of ownership. So about this old idea of the commons, that for instance, this in combination with, let's say, local new forms of identity, that people say, okay, now in our village, in our neighborhood, we want to own our electricity, or our, I don't know, whatsoever, or we want to keep our bookstore. We don't want to be anything bought on Amazon, etc. So what I find very interesting is that in this last chapter of the book, you have a lot of discussion 50 years ago about all these different forms of steward ownership and collective ownership.
Yeah. And we spoke about this before the show, and I think the idea of, well, the first point he makes, I think, which is important, is that by creating more owners of a business, you don't just enhance the quantity of owners, right? You enhance the quality of ownership. Right? That's an important point he makes, because as people feel like they have a greater stake in this business that they're in, the overall quality of the sort of, I suppose, the stewardship of that organization improves, it in aggregate. And I thought that was an important point.
But the company he was, let's say, he founded or he was acting as an advisor still exists. So I don't know if you ever have interviewed people of this company. It could be interesting because let's say nowadays the longevity of those companies becomes shorter and shorter all the time, and it also could be a kind of counterintuitive aspect again, that by giving away it is also this whole idea of swarm intelligence, that let's say by giving more people a vote, you have a better quality of your decision making. It's also kind of this whole idea. We have a very smart leader. I mean, at the moment, we're very lucky that we have Trump. So it shows the risk of to give somebody, a leader, enormous power. But you also have this in this whole forms of ownership. So I'm very curious what will happen. My personal idea is that I think we will come back to collective forms of ownership. So this whole public space will be recaptured by, let's say, the people. But I don't know what areas will be earlier. So will this be in the beginning, let's say, local forms of energy or public transport or saving the bookstore, or I don't know, or because let's say since the 80s it had been the other way around. We privatized everything because we thought that would make sense. So which government will first start to nationalize stuff again? Because we found out that it was counterproductive for all of us. So is it possible that the Labour government in the UK would nationalize certain public goods again?
Yeah.
Like railway or something like that.
And I have to say that in general, the idea of nationalization terrifies me, because that is big. That is big state owning big entities. On the contrary, this idea of a local community taking stewardship of, let's say, their electricity production, or let's say their internet provision, something along that line, along those lines, actually, I think can enhance can enhance our culture and give us greater connection to our infrastructure, and give us a willingness to look after our environment in a different way. But I think the idea of
I wanted to provoke you a little bit. So for instance, in Zurich, where I live, the city electricity, it's owned by the people. So if you want to privatize this, you have to do a plebiscite. It's called plebiscite, and so you have to
public vote.
You have to do a public vote, and then people say no, we're against it. Or there was the railway is owned by the people. It's not privatized. The buses and the trams is public ownership. So and then if people say no, we want to skip those lines or those train services because it's much cheaper and we could earn we could have higher profits, then people have to vote on this, and people say no, we're not willing because that's our public infrastructure. And I think that we're on a kind of turning point where for different reasons, if you for instance take circular economy or let's say also energy, if you want to, let's say, solve the CO2 problem, it's let's say it doesn't fit to an energy company, because an energy company who wants to, let's say, act in a normal business way wants to produce more energy, not less energy. But it's in our public interest to save our world to produce less energy. So I think that this nationalization or this regaining, let's say, public space which has been privatized in the past will in the beginning much more focused on certain topics where we realize together that for a company it doesn't work. So we want to produce less and less energy to solve our CO2 problem. That's something for a business company who is stock listed and want to have higher revenues and higher profits doesn't fit to our common goal.
Right. And none of that works if one hasn't adopted a sort of an ethical framework in order to conduct that activity, whether you're in private or in public, right? Because a public entity might be an equally bad actor, right? If they're not coming at it from a from an ethical perspective, from a philosophical perspective. So I do think that's in some senses, the bigger challenge.
But you have the same with education. So what will happen with education in for instance, the US? So if college fees become higher and higher all the time, and now you have this combination of online, then at a certain point the question is, if we want to do something in our country, and if education or social mobility is one of the goals of our society, is it possible to not use video to educate everybody and say, no, we're not sharing this knowledge? You should pay $100,000 to enter an Ivy League university. And in the past, it was, you just could say, okay, there was not a possibility of sharing this knowledge, like in the Middle Ages, that the books were in the monasteries. But now you have this technical possibility. So why do we still think that it's acceptable to ask the $100,000 fee for Ivy League university if you can just share this knowledge everywhere online?
Well, yeah, and I do agree that that's now just become a kind of racket, hasn't it? It's almost become like a sort of status racket, the whole, to a large degree, certainly in the US.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, but I have to say that I was educated in publicly funded schools, state schools, as we would call them in the UK, and I was, in a sense, trained to be a sort of mindless consumer, right?
Yeah.
And an unthinking employee in the ways that we've described. So, that's why I have little faith that public ownership per se would necessarily help. However, the idea of a small community, a group of families in a village coming together to socialize the cost of a school, let's say, with the intent to educate along ethical, philosophical lines, that I'm compelled by that idea. In exactly the same way that I find Schumacher's ideas. It's small, it's beautiful. The shareholders of that enterprise are having an ownership and a stake in it. Yeah.
So who should read this book? Everybody. I would say everybody. What I find striking and also a little bit disturbing, that let's say the phase we are in now in this whole COVID crisis, which let's say gave us a lot of reflection, not only about the way we work or home office, etc., but also on the bigger problems of society, democracy, ecological stuff, flying around, saving airliners, etc. So you have a lot of discussion going on in the public space. And if you read this book, Small's Beautiful, 50 years ago, these are exactly the same topics. And what I found really disturbing is that that we're not much further than we were in the 70s, which I found really difficult to deal with or to cope with. So let's say if people in the current discussion say, no, we're really going forward and we're going fast, I would say we have to look more into history, or in this case in the 70s, just to remind ourselves that much more energy should be put into this debate for real change, because otherwise in 50 years we were reading, let's say, the current books of Matsukato and all those others, and nothing really has happened again. And also the whole structure of power is much more dominant in the current times than it was in the 70s.
Well, yes. I mean, that came up in an interview I did last week was that we know the Pareto principle, right?
Yeah.
80-20, that 20% of firms in any given market will have 80% of the revenue or the market share, or it might be. He made the point that in the internet context, with this new level of communication technology that's never existed for us before, it's more like 95-5.
Yeah,
so we've
correct.
actually bent the Pareto principle with our modern technology. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's probably worse than a lot of what Schumacher described. Yeah. So, but for those of us who want to fight the good fight, for those of us who want to take a different direction, certainly I think this would serve as inspiration. And your broader point of reading history, learning from history. In fact, the same guy I just mentioned suggests that you should, every week, you should at least read one book or read part of one book that was written before we had the printing press, pre-Gutenberg.
That's interesting.
I liked as a
instructive. Yeah, perhaps you should also mention that this book is on the, I don't know on what list, but you said it's one of the 100
most influential books.
Yeah.
Of last century. Yeah, I don't recall exactly which list that
was.
But
I mean, at the moment when the book was published, it was a bestseller.
Yeah.
He also spoke in the US, was invited by Carter in the White House, etc. So it was an important book in the 70s. And it's funny thing is when I put this on LinkedIn, a lot of people who are much older than I am said, "Oh, it's great, you're reading this book again. I read this when I was at the university, etc." So very influential book, and I think it really makes sense to read it just to see that the topics we're discussing at the moment were there 50 years ago, and we should really do much more than we do at the moment to change our societies.
All right. On that note, Tom, thank you very much, and thank you for bringing this book to my attention, to making the suggestion of us doing a podcast on it. I appreciate that. I hope that was useful for people listening. Go buy the book, and thanks again, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.